on new trends in scholarly communications. The series as a whole is called Research Without Borders, The Changing World of Scholarly Communications. And today's discussion is on the future of learned societies. It's being co-sponsored by the Office of the Provost as well as the Center. Our Provost, Claude Steele, is off on a provostial trip, as I'm sure Jim will know from his own experience, and unfortunately couldn't come. I'm Stephen Rittenberg. I'm the Senior Vice Provost. The Center for Digital Research and Scholarship is dedicated to serving the Columbia community in several different ways. It develops new ways of communication using the new information technologies. It works with individual faculty in using those technologies. And it sponsors events like this to educate the community about important new developments in scholarly communication. The series has a six-part to it. The first one had to do with blogging, which I'm still not quite certain exactly what it is, but it's blogging with a particular emphasis upon blogging by feminists. Future sessions will deal with open access journals, with PubMed, which is the online database for scientists in the life sciences, and the implications of open data initiatives for funded scientific and scholarly research. So, our featured speaker today is James O'Donnell, the provost at Georgetown. You'll also be hearing from Eric Weinberg from our Department of Physics. Provost O'Donnell has a long and varied career as a scholar, as an innovative leader in the use of information technologies. A scholar of ancient Mediterranean history and culture. He received his PhD from Yale, and before moving to Georgetown, taught at Bryn Mawr, Catholic University, Cornell, and Penn. Somewhere along the way, he acquired a considerable interest in how information technologies can be used to promote higher education and scholarly research. He helped to found one of the earliest online journals in the humanities. He began to use the internet as an educational tool when it was neither common or easy to do. And for several years, he served as the vice provost for information systems and computing at the University of Pennsylvania. On a more personal note, I discovered by looking on the web that he grew up watching rockets launched from the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, and has a town in Texas that has been allegedly named after his family. So, Professor Weinberg, who will be commenting on his talk, is a full professor on our Department of Physics, a product of the PhD program at Harvard. He joined Columbia shortly after getting his degree and has served here in a variety of capacities, including as chair of his department. He's an elementary particle theorist who has worked in the areas of quantum field theory and cosmology, and more recently has been interested in properties of black holes. I'm a historian by background, and I can't resist the temptation to say that some of this sounds like Greek to me. So, in addition, he has been very active in the American Physical Society, where he's been a fellow for many, many years, and has also been very involved with its scholarly journals, scientific journals, and actually is serving and has been serving for, I guess, over a decade now as editor of the Physical Review D, which is a leading journal in elementary particle physics, field theory, gravitation, and cosmology. So I would ask you all to join me in welcoming Provost James O'Donnell and Professor Eric Weinberg.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out. This talk has a history. It began with, as talks often do, a title and a good intention. It's now having a history because I find myself on the road this fall in a variety of settings in which I thought it would be useful for me to try in different settings with different perspectives for different audiences to talk about some things that I'm finding important in my own work and that I think have a broader importance in the profession at large. I say that by way of explaining that there may come a point in this talk when you think I have wandered off down a garden path. That is the logical result of having written the talk, given it once before, and thought about what I learned from that. I gave it 2 weeks ago at the University of Delhi in India at something called the International Conference of Academic Librarians, which was the first such held on the Indian subcontinent. Hundreds of librarians, not only from India, but from surrounding countries. I met Nepali, Iranian, and Iraqi scholars in the course of that. And found it, as I always do in such settings, valuable to think about my concerns in a setting in which there are very many other concerns that are not mine. And to think about how we arbitrage and connect ourselves across this global community that emerges. My theme is the future of learned societies. The Learned Society goes back several hundred years. We believe we know that the Royal Society in London published the first thing we call a scholarly journal in 1665. And one of the things learned societies do is publish journals. Indeed, the reason I could be sure I would be able to meet this obligation in New York and not be sucked off on some other provostial trip is that I'm here for the board meeting of the American Council of Learned Societies. And one of the criteria that we have for membership in the ACLS to determine whether something is a learned society is indeed whether it publishes a journal. How you administer that technical requirement is an interesting one in these days. But indeed, learned societies are often defined by the way they support publication. My particular and yet more personal reason for this set of concerns is that for my sins, I am serving a 4-year term now as Vice President of the American Philological Association for publications. And I inherit a journal, a monograph series, a textbook series, and the obligation in that 4 years to appoint new editors for each of those 3, and to think about what the directions of the society and the directions of its publications might be. So I'm going to begin a bit by talking about that association and what the presenting symptoms, as it were, in my life happen to be, and then go on a bit of a journey of meditative exploration about what might be real issues that stand behind some of the apparent issues facing an organization like this. The American Philological Association was founded in 1869. It is one of the oldest learned societies in the United States. When it began, we had responsibility for the philological examination of languages, whatever they might be. At various points, other languages and other professions spun themselves off from us, so we don't see as many articles on Sanskrit in our journals and publications as we used to. And the foundation of the Linguistic Society of America in about 1920 created a different, in fact, embodied the creation of a different discipline, and much of what we had felt responsible for before then went away. The APA at this point is essentially the professional home for classicists, for people who worry about the Greek and Latin worlds, not including archaeologists. The Archaeological Institute of America is the home for them, but the APA and the AIA come together for 3 days every year, meet for joint meetings, periodically discuss getting divorces because some of us devoutly believe in meeting between Christmas and New Year's, and some of us devoutly believe in meeting the week after. And we've had that war going on for 15 or 20 years. At the moment, there's no talk of divorce, and we're all perfectly happy and friendly together, embodying for those few days each year. This year it will be just outside the gates of Disneyland, no comment, what it means to study the Greek and Latin tradition and the worlds in which those languages were spoken. The journal is the point of my particular interest and concern at this moment, and I'll say a word or two about it. It was founded as the Transactions of the American Philological Association in 1869. In 1897, the title was changed to Transactions and Proceedings of the American Philological Association, and for over 70 years, The volumes were published incorporating the papers delivered at the annual meetings and such other reports of, committee reports, accounts of business, accounts of treasurer's report, and that sort of thing, embodying the business of the association in a single volume. In those days already, we saw that the journal was published annually in a kind of maroon buckram. And I well remember that when I was an undergraduate, I judged the wisdom and maturity of my faculty guides and mentors by the long row of maroon buckram volumes growing on the shelf behind their desk. I remember the pride and pleasure with which in 1976 I got my first one, and imagined that this row would grow now, extending all the way to infinity, because I am going to live forever. One or two things have happened along the way. In the year 1973 disappeared mysteriously. Just checking these numbers last night, I said I realized I can't remember what exactly happened in 1973. I was almost in the profession then. But the proceedings part went away, and we went back to being the Transactions of the American Philological Association. For a couple of years, small pamphlets were published called The Proceedings of the APA. That then morphed into a newsletter, and I leave to one side the archival and library concern about what happens to recording the business of our association when it's no longer incorporated in the back pages of our journal, but instead is in a newsletter that I am pretty sure is not being collected with the assiduousness with which our journal is being collected anywhere. Another thing that happened in that time is that our annual meetings grew. When I was young, there were a total of 30 or 40 papers being given at one of these three-day meetings at the end of the year. The last summary number I saw suggested we now do about 400 talks at the meetings. To publish all 400 in the course of the next year would require several volumes. We don't do that. So in fact, the gap between what is the transactions and proceedings of the association in Congress assembled and what shows up in the journal has widened considerably. The one thing you can say with reasonable probability is that the presidential address will appear in the journal. After that, articles may or may not have had a former life as talks at the annual meetings. The row of maroon volumes did indeed extend across the shelf behind my desk in my office at the University of Pennsylvania for many years, until about 10 years ago. Then reality intruded, and we discovered two different things. One was a new publishing partner, the Johns Hopkins University Press, didn't much like the idea of doing annuals. And we discovered that doing annuals in modern American research libraries meant nobody would see you, because the annual volume shows up in the library and is immediately stickered and moved to the shelf. The soft-covered journal fascicle, on the other hand, moves to the journal periodical reading room, the departmental seminar room, something like that. And we discovered that by moving from hardcover to softcover, we could save money and develop a larger audience, improving as well our production stream, because we now do 2 issues a year instead of 1. I'm still in denial about this, so my long row of buckram volumes are actually shelved behind a row of other volumes in my kitchen at this particular moment. And the new softcover fascicles, which are really quite handsome and have the same maroon coloring about them, are now leaking around there. We've gone through about 10 years of those. This is a journal of distinction and importance. One measure of that is I can tell you that the Columbia University Department of Classics numbers both a past and a future editor of TAPA on its faculty. Jim Zetzel is a past editor. Katharina Folk is coming in next January. I will give you a sense of the urgency of concerns with which editors deal nowadays to tell you yesterday's email firestorm, which arose when we discovered that because we accepted an article for the next issue, which contains a significant gallery of, gasp, what a thought, illustrations, images, pictures, we were just on the point of producing an issue which, together with the plastic bag in which we mail it, would go just a titch over, or might go just a titch over, 16 ounces in weight. I should tell you the United States Post Office is not thrilled by this prospect and proposes to establish a substantial surcharge on us in the order of several $1,000s of mailing if we allow ourselves to go over. So the critical editorial task for yesterday was to figure out if the pages could be rearranged and the illustrations done and a couple of pages left out to keep it down to the point where you're really sure that it won't weigh 16 ounces. One problem in this is you don't know whether it beats the post office weight until you have the thing itself, the plastic bag, and the person in a blue uniform all in the same place together. And if the person in the blue uniform thinks it tips over 16 ounces, you're in trouble. So you wind up aiming to come in a little low. You know, this is one of those business moments where everything that I've just described to you makes perfect sense. But if you kind of pull back the camera and say, what are these grown-ups doing? You have to say, this is nuts. This is not exactly work for serious, responsible scholars. This is not what we went to graduate school for. But it's the kind of bind we find ourselves in. We're going to have a retreat this winter at an O'Hare Airport Hotel in which we bring together members of the association's publications committee and a few other officers and former officers of the organization to talk about what it is we should be doing. And I suppose the way I can describe and defend this talk I'm giving is to say it's evolved from the point at which we would spend most of our time talking about the 16-ounce problem and be able to talk about issues that really do affect what it is we imagine we're doing when we publish serious scholarship in the early years of the 21st century. So here's a point at which I need to turn a bit of a corner. Here's a piece of text that I would like to read to you. I'll tell you whence it comes recently, but I found it because of my continuing interest in my dissertation topic and my pursuit of new material and new evidence on that topic, now lo, these 30 years later. And I quote, "Got an compelling query a while tushy that took a lot of inspect, but which was also sheerest educational. The questioner wrote, interesting call for. I was recently researching Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and in Chapter 5, he, on the mostly, provides basis of the Bible's survivability, all the technique through meanwhile. He points dated that the Bible has survived longer and on the mostly has been copied so distinct more times than other works. Isn't that a tumefaction of a half-truth? I hear tell that the case church hardened to fling away non-Christian creative writings or abolish it as in the Josephus authentication, where a Christian grave added in the subdivision anent Jesus. If you were like me, there are whole moments in what I've just read that almost seem to make sense. One person I showed it to, the tumefaction of a half-truth. Now, isn't that a phrase? Isn't that language being used just at the margin in a perfectly transparent kind of way? It goes on. I'm not going to read you the rest of this, but the Islamic in every respect on the other meter did not suffer the accommodating of disheartening ages that the Christian in every respect did. You know, that's almost English in several respects. How did I find this? Well, I found this because I have a Google alert set on the name of Cassiodorus, my dissertation topic, a 6th century scholar and monk who lived in Italy, worked in government, had a monastery, copied manuscripts, wrote a great many books. So I set my Google alert, and I have one Google alert to track him down. I get fewer hits on that than I get on James O'Donnell, because it turns out that James O'Donnell is also the CEO of BMW North America, the CEO of American Eagle Outfitters, and the organist at Westminster Cathedral. So I have to do a certain filtering on the information that I get for that one. But I don't hear about Cassiodorus unless we're talking about Cassiodorus, and that's the good news. So this one comes from a perfectly respectable sounding address, paganism.edublogs.org. If any of you are particularly fond of James Joyce's later writing, I recommend it. It's a puzzling web page, and I have not made up my mind what to make about it. There is a seriousness about it. The listing of months of prior pages of this blog running down, it's one of these standard blogging softwares. The listing of the months gives the names of the months in Finnish, which is interesting. And some part of me wonders whether this stuff has been machine translated. Feed the Finnish into a computer translator and get this English coming out the other side. Perhaps, perhaps not. I'd like to know what the Finnish for tumefaction of a half-truth is, because it is indeed a beautiful kind of phrase. If you are interested, this stuff goes on and on and on. And I've been checking. I found this about a month ago. I've been checking back. There's more of it every day. And it's all like this. And it betrays a kind of serious intellectual interest, glimmers of seriousness of intellectual performance, though I give you a sample here which suggests that the underlying interest is an amateur scholar's obsession with Bible study, authentication of the Bible, Bible texts, and so forth. There are lots of those out there. There are none that are anything quite like this. My reason for lingering over this is that I vividly remember, that when I was a graduate student, prowling in those days every single level of the 15 layers of the stacks of the Sterling Memorial Library in New Haven, finding material for my dissertation indeed on every single one of those stacked floors, there wasn't anything like this for me to deal with. This was not part of the scholarly discourse on my dissertation topic. I didn't have to worry about this kind of thing. Now, one respectable move of the last decade or so has been to dismiss the internet generically, dismiss the kind of stuff you find on the internet, and, for want of a better word, bury your head in the sand, comfortable and confident that the transactions of the American Philological Association, for example, will be able to save you from having to take any such thing seriously. Here's where my trip to India and some other contacts in the last year give me pause. The liveliest moment of the International Conference on Academic Libraries in India was when the argument broke out among the participants on the question whether the internet is a library or not. I think I am happy to say that the majority prevailed in arguing that the internet is not a library, and most of you could reproduce the argument that would be made to demonstrate that. But there was a strong presence in the room of people who live on a subcontinent in which educational and cultural institutions are mostly underfunded, difficult of access. University of Delhi has 150,000 students. Its students are separated among 68 different colleges in the Delhi area. The limited library facilities on the campus in North Delhi are, on a good day, an hour's drive away. On a bad day, they're a lot further away from that. They are small, they are cramped, they are crowded. The Vice Chancellor whom I met is not sure where they're going to put things and is puzzled by the fact that people seem to need air conditioning when they show up to come and sit in libraries as well. And he understands that we believe that the materials also need air conditioning. He doesn't know how he can provide any better facilities than he now provides. For that kind of audience, I can well imagine that there are many very serious people pursuing academic, scholarly, and research topics of considerable importance with the greatest seriousness, for whom the internet is as good as or better than any library to which they do themselves genuinely and personally have access. And no amount of pious protesting on my part, no amount of sententious and authoritative statement on the part of those in the room who are holding out for the internet not being a library will persuade people otherwise. My other point of contact from this, and I recognize that the plural of anecdote is not data, is a young scholar whom I met when he stood up in a room like this and asked me a question when I had given a lecture at Fudan University in Shanghai. It was perhaps the best question I've ever been asked after a lecture in my life, and it involved comparative analysis of my own scholarly work with that of two or three other distinguished Anglophone scholars working in the same period. So after I stammered my way through the answer and answered some other questions, I made sure to pull this fellow aside. Xia Dongqi is Associate Professor of History at Fudan University with a PhD from Renmin University in in Beijing, otherwise known as People's University, the one that now has a statue of Confucius on the campus where you would not have expected to find a statue of Confucius 30 years ago. His dissertation advisor at Renmin was a Chinese scholar who had taken a doctorate in canon law at the Catholic University of America. And Professor Xia had done his own dissertation, which he was pleased to give me a copy of later, in two very substantial volumes on Augustine's City of God. The volumes are in Chinese. I've had someone look at them enough to tell me that they are what they say they are. The one scholarly judgment I can make is that the bibliography is much of it in Roman characters, and by golly, he's done a very good job. He's been reading the right things. He has a substantial bibliography of material that should be in a contemporary study about Augustine's City of God. So I've been in touch back and forth by email, and once indeed got to see him in the United States when he came to the States as a chaperone of sorts for a tour of Chinese students. And I will just say it's interesting to talk to someone who's working on Augustine in China. There are aspects of Augustine's attitude toward human sexuality that, challenging as they might be for an Anglophone European society, are completely impenetrable to a society of young people who have grown up under Maoism in China. I'm learning a lot from this conversation. The disconcerting moment came when I published another book, and I sent Dr. Shah a copy, and he thanked me very warmly for it by email, but it took a while for it to get out there. And he said he'd already gotten the electronic version. The electronic version, I said? Yes, and he gave me a URL, and I went to the URL and found that indeed HarperCollins had published an ebook version of my book, and about 20 minutes after it was published, it was bootlegged onto this site, which is a download site for distributing electronic books around the world, and my friend Dr. Shah was delighted that he would be able to share my book with his students. I expressed my sharing of his delight in measured and restrained tones, sent an email message to my publisher, and went away scratching my head some more over just what to make of this. But indeed, he tells me in cold prose that access to library research materials for the kind of field he works in is a significant challenge for him. It generally involves travel, and it generally means that there will not be in China the kind of adequate materials that he would need to be a recognized scholar of standing, competitive with my other students who are working at American and European universities. I, on several parts of my brain, disapprove of that site, and several other parts of my brain fully understand how that site comes about and recognize the rationality and even the responsibility of the individuals who are trying to get the best information they can, use the best information they can by whatever means might be possible. That's the world we live in. So let me linger for a moment on the world we have left behind by point of comparison, and then try to draw a lesson from that. This is the Marquis Scipione Maffei, a gentleman of Verona in the early 18th century, a polymath of various kinds, a troublemaker of various kinds, but a scholar of no mean accomplishments. I've known and told this story for years, but it's a great story about information technology, whatever else it is. In the year 1713, in conversation with the chapter librarian at the Cathedral of Verona, Maffei was encouraged to believe that there were more manuscripts in the library than they had yet found. And so, one day, he and the chapter librarian go rootling about. And they go into a darkened back room where a very large armarium, that's Latin for armoire, and that's what books used to be kept in, was standing up against the wall. And they looked at it and they opened it, and it had interesting old books in it, but they got interested in the top of it and thought there was something funny about where the top of the case was and where the inside ceiling of the case was. So they went to fetch a ladder, and they climbed up, and they found that on top of the armoire there were loosely attached wooden slats, and under those slats, manuscripts. At that point, Maffei did not have a good estimate of how old those manuscripts were, or how long they had been there. Best modern scholarship suggests they had been on top of that armoire under those wooden slats for about 150 years. The manuscript that I know about this from, that brought this to my attention, was a manuscript of the work of my friend Cassiodorus. It is a manuscript dating from the 6th century. It is probably not by Cassiodorus' own hand or his scriptorium, but probably a first generation copy of that. There aren't a lot of manuscripts of that vintage surviving in that condition, but indeed it came down from off top of the armoire and was in perfectly good, suitable, usable condition, a parchment manuscript, and contained a work of Cassiodorus of which we knew from his other writings, but which we had never had a copy of before. And so in 1721, Maffei publishes this with great pride. It has the distinction of being the dullest and least important work that Cassiodorus ever wrote, but never mind. Now, I used to want to believe, and I think I may have said in my dissertation, that the manuscript had been there on top of that cabinet for over 1,000 years, and I was disappointed when I reviewed it recently and found that it was only 150 years. But speaking as one who has not yet lived 150 years, 150 years is in fact a very long time. And it's a very long time in a society in which people don't live to 80 and 90 and 100 years old. Those books had been out of human care and attention, unbeknownst to anyone in that chapter library, for several generations of care and keeping. And yet, when they came out, they were in fine condition. They still contained all the information that they had originally contained, and all of the software and hardware you needed to process them was readily available to you. Now, I've told this story for 15 years in some form or another by way of compare and contrast to the technology of digital information, which by and large does not rest on top of bookcases and armoires for 15 years, much less 150 years, much less 1,000 years, and turn out then to be readable in any meaningful form. If you are like me and you have some boxes of floppy disks that you never converted over to hard disks, I think I have some bad news for you. You might want to talk to me about it afterwards, but they may not actually be floppy disks anymore. In fact, it's probable that they are not. But what strikes me as we continue to live through the age of digital information is not the mere fact of preservation, but something else about the fact of quantity. So I made a nuisance of myself, and I asked my gracious hosts to fetch these volumes out of, is it the Ancient and Medieval, Medieval and Renaissance, ANCMED, Ancient and Medieval Seminar Room. These two volumes were published in the 1860s in Paris by the Abbé Migne. They are volumes 69 and 70 of something we colloquially call the Patrologia Latina. The real title, when extracted by bibliographers, runs for several lines. The definitive book to date on the editor of these was written by a then member of the Columbia faculty, Howard Block. It was called God's Plagiarist, about the Abbé Jean-Paul Migne, who spent the middle years of the 19th century publishing the Church Fathers and other works of useful theology in Latin and Greek in cheap editions for the use of the parish clergy of the French Catholic Church. So these two volumes are two of 225. Which embody the work of the Latin Church from the earliest writings in the 2nd century down to the 13th century. When he finished this series, the Abbé Migne turned around and did another 170-some volumes of the Greek Fathers, and there are whole rafts of encyclopedias and collections of scholastic theologians and whatnot. He was a one-man publishing industry. The particular piece of evidence on which Howard relied for his monograph was in fact the dossier that was found on the Abbé Jean-Paul Migne in the archives of the Paris police, who had had more than one occasion to inspect his business dealings over time. This is Cassiodorus. My man Cassiodorus fills about half of this volume and all of this volume, about 1,200 columns. All but 80 columns of that had been printed in an edition by the French Benedictine Jean Garet in 1679 in Paris. I was lucky enough to find a copy of that a few years ago at a price that I could just about afford, but I didn't think it would get through screening at US Air this morning as a personal item. It's a little bit bulky for purposes of getting on and off the airplane, but it replaces, in fact, the Yale University Library copy, which spent 2 years in the mid-1970s residing on top of a filing cabinet in my apartment. They actually, in 1973, let me check out a 1679 book and take it home and renew it indefinitely until I graduated. I had this put here by reason of helping us think about quantity, because quantity is something that human beings, I find, think about most imperfectly indeed. A provost of a highly selective institution has an experience of this every time one of our loyal alumni, one of the loyal parents from our community, comes up to me and tells me that they have a 17-year-old child who actually is extraordinarily bright and would be just fine for Georgetown. I am obliged at that point to say thank you very much. You realize that we have 19,000 applications for 1,500 spaces, to which the parent will always say, yes, I understand that, but my daughter is really bright. The lack of understanding, which I try not to rub their noses in at that point, is that of those 19,000 applications, there are on average 38,000 parents who think that those children are in fact really bright. We need to use some other selection mechanism other than taking mom and dad's word for it in order to decide which 1,500 will wind up on the campus, and 1,500 is in fact a small percentage of 19,000. It's just plain tough. In fact, the last numbers we saw suggested that of those 19,000, something like 2,200, that is to say more than we have seats for, have graduated as first in their class in high school. That's how smart, really smart gets to be when you've got those kind of numbers. But 10 to 1 is a ratio that human beings, because we've got 10 fingers, know something about. And in principle, we can do something with a 10 to 1 ratio. When Maffei discovered the Complexiones on the epistles by Cassiodorus, he knew he was adding to the store of knowledge. So he was adding, out of the 1,600 or so columns in these two books, he was adding another 100 columns or so. Appreciable, not overwhelming. If it weren't so dull, it might be more significant, but nevertheless making a real contribution to the store of what we had from the 6th century. Since this time, I would say the most important thing that has happened is that one of Cassiodorus' most important books was given a really good edition in 1937. It's a book which, Cassiodorus seems to have put through several revisions and improvements over time, and so working the manuscript tradition to figure out what was the archaic form, what was the first round of corrections, what was the second round of corrections. That's what people like me do, that's what people like me enjoy reading about. And so on that one particular regard, the edition of his Institutes that we now use is far better than what's in these books and should not, the one in these books should not be consulted. Other works have been edited, they have been improved in a variety of ways, and they are now much better than they were in the 19th century, but you would not go so far wrong if you read from this collection. That's good news for a very important reason, which is to say that wherever you are and whatever you are doing, if you are a member of the Columbia University community and you have a decent wireless connection, you can read these books. Because about 15 years ago, a commercial publisher decided to produce the online Patrologia Latina database, digitized everything in these 225 volumes, sold it to libraries at a substantial price, and Pat Renfro and I had a conversation about it in those days when she was buying them, and I was not quite sure I wanted to recommend that they be bought. An irony of that, which I will mention only in passing, is it means that I now spend much more time in the digital age paying attention to the 19th century editions of Cassiodorus than I ever did before, because these are with me on the train with my wireless broadband. But the well-printed, not digitally available, bulky volumes of the best editions, those are back in my office. And my office, at least, is a place where they don't leave me a whole lot of time to play with such things. So here's the issue I want to frame and juxtapose. In the world which mentally most of us as scholars grew up, were trained, live and breathe, this kind of object and Maffei's kind of discovery constitutes normal scholarship. In my lifetime, we've had two of those discoveries in the works of Augustine, for example. 25 letters were discovered in the 1970s. Another 20 or so sermons were discovered in the 1990s. Another half dozen sermons were discovered a year or two ago, and I felt particularly proud because when they asked me whether I would approve the research project which involved going around and cataloging those manuscripts, I recommended in favor of it, so I thought I had helped find those sermons. Total quantity of enhancement of Augustine's works, and that is by quantity trivial, although some of the letters are indeed quite interesting and help fill in the gaps for some stories we didn't know before, and we're glad we have. What I learned from paganism.edublogs.com is that those days are over for a reason that I think sometimes escapes attention. And that is that whatever we do, and however faithfully we continue to carry out the Abbe Mina, the Scipio Maffei, the discovery of manuscripts work that we have practiced for hundreds of years, we are now doing so in an environment that has changed dramatically. We are surrounded by quantities of information beyond our imagining. It's not a 10 to 1 ratio. It's far larger than that. And whatever you imagine the ratio to be now, remember this. It was 15 years ago this month that Netscape Navigator was released for the first time. Mosaic, the first graphical web browser, was about a year older than that. I used to say in the talks like this I gave 15 years ago that Netscape was the commercial product with the most rapid market penetration of any product in history. Within literally weeks, anyone who had Mosaic had converted to Netscape, and copies were morphing throughout the universe. This space in which we imagine ourselves living, and whose magnitude we cannot begin to imagine, is only 15 years old. We turned on the fire hose. We turned on all the fire hydrants 15 years ago. That's fine. And 150 years from now, please, the length of time that those manuscripts spent sitting on top of the chapter library armoire in Verona, just how much will have come from the fire hose by then? What will it mean in that world to have imagined publishing? So let me go back. One more set of numbers that I wanted to linger over. This will also give you some quantity for where the problem has gotten already. Brian Lavoie and Roger Schoenfeld of Ithaca, the Mellon spin-off organization, did a study now 4 years ago of the age of books in research libraries. I say this, what's in Butler, these aren't Butler numbers, these are OCLC numbers based on research libraries. They went and looked at the total number of records, the total number of holdings of books in OCLC libraries, and looked at them by date. And look at that. Only 18% of what you find in research libraries is pre-1923. Why do we care? Because 1923 is the date before which everything is presumptively out of copyright and available in the public domain. After 1923, for complicated legal reasons, the public domainishness of things deteriorates rapidly. Google's working assumption is that if it's published after 1923, printed after 1923, they will treat it as in copyright because they can't be absolutely sure without some work that it's not. And on the other hand, when they did this study, 1977 to 2005 was responsible for 50% of the materials. My own PhD is in 1975. That means that already 4 years ago, more than half of what the modern American Research Library holds had been published after I got my doctoral dissertation. If we have continued at 4 more years producing material and bringing in at the rate at which we bring it in, that 50% number has probably migrated forward a couple of more years. We're probably up to the early Reagan years by now. And the situation in the short term is not getting any better. That's already immense quantity with which to have to deal. No surprise that one of the most attention-getting book titles of the last year, and a book that I'm recommending to everyone I now meet, because it was reviewed so uncomprehendingly, and it's really a delightful book, is Pierre Bayard's How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. It was reviewed by and large by people who took it seriously and did not recognize the irony. Bayard's theme is more the fact that we all live in a space in which most of the books that exist by a vast proportion are books we haven't read, and we do in fact talk about them in one form or another all the time. It's a more subtle and sophisticated book than that, and I strongly recommend it, but it's a book for our time in which the possibility of mastering the literature on any subject is, if it was ever a truism, has disappeared from us once and for all. So I come back to my initial concerns with learned societies and publication in learned societies. If this is what's happened to the world already, if this is what the world is turning into and what it will become, what does it mean now to publish? So let me go through the obvious. It means to select, identify, bring together, revise, and edit work of merit. We know how to do that. The editors of the Transactions of the American Philological Association know how to do that. By and large, we get 100 or so submissions a year. We select from them 40 or so. We work on them very hard. We copy edit them. We make sure their footnotes are all in good order. We go back and forth to the author, and we produce something of extraordinarily high quality. All right, we know how to do that. Provide the work a secure channel for distribution. We know and we don't know how to do that. Printing, binding, and mailing, whatever it is the post office charges us, we know how to do that. Distributing electronically, we're pretty sure we know how to do that. The APA, in fact, backed into electronic publication. We suffer from the embarrassment that our journal is in fact housed in JSTOR, the back issues of JSTOR, and at the time when the issues were first released in JSTOR, no officer or employee of the APA could actually remember signing a contract allowing them to do that. We later found out that we had, but it just kind of happened one day when we weren't looking. We publish now with the Johns Hopkins University Press, and as most of you intuit, that means that we also distribute through Project Muse. That's where our current issues are. Our historical run is in JSTOR. Well, we think we know how to do that. That is a secure channel for distribution. It probably doesn't reach my colleague, Dr. Shah, in Fudan, and it certainly doesn't reach a good many of the people at my meeting in New Delhi a couple of weeks ago. It may not reach even places and people in the United States that you would think it reaches. I was startled the other day that a colleague at Arizona State University told me that she does not have access to the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, the standard collection of Greek texts of classical Greek literature online. ASU does not have a classics department per se, and has never paid the small number of hundreds of dollars of subscription for what I take for granted as a resource that, of course, every scholar has access to. She tells me that she still writes to her colleague at Duke University, who runs the searches for her and sends the results back when she wants to find things. The channel of distribution may be secure, but if it's not actually reaching even that primary audience, much less a new and growing audience, then the security of that channel is one thing. But one more piece of work is that we must ensure the preservation of the work for as long as the author, the editor, and the readers think useful. And I think it is fair to say, summarizing a great deal of work by a great many hardworking, responsible, serious, authoritative people, that we ain't there yet. There's a lot of good work has been done. There are projects that know how to preserve digital objects. I will be the 150-year perspective person right now and say, we won't know for another 135 years whether we have figured out how to keep this kind of information available, usable, accessible for that kind of period of time. That will depend a lot on technology, and it will depend even more on human beings to care about this stuff in order to make sure that particular things of value remain considered to be things of value as they go forward. But the last thing a publisher does, and the reason why they always tell you not to publish your own novel yourself, but to get a real publisher, is not any of those first things, but indeed to make sure that you can bring your work to the attention of an audience. And HarperCollins is much better at bringing work to the attention of an audience than I personally am, even if I master the techniques of blog and Twitter and viral marketing. The traditional publisher has known in European-style, industrialized societies how to attract the attention of an audience, how to provide channels through which the person who would really use the information is able to find that information and make some use of it. Those days, it seems to me, are really gone at this point, when the challenge for finding material in this set of fire hoses, this set of fire hydrants producing information, is already considerable. Those of you who teach will know the challenge of making sure that your students come back with information that is reliable. The paganism blog that I showed you is an extreme case. I doubt that any of my students will actually cut and paste text from that page to put into a paper for me. I hope that if they do, I will detect it fairly readily. I hope this will happen across the country and across the world, but I cannot always be certain that this will happen. Let me give you an example of how that can be challenging. I started to tell a different story about this morning. About 35 years ago, in those graduate student days, a colleague of mine and I published a joke festschrift in honor of one of our venerated teachers who was leaving Yale University to teach at Southern Methodist. His name was Jeremy Adams. We called it the Lamentationes Jeremiae, which is the name of the book of the Bible of the Lamentations of Jeremiah. We thought Lamentations of Jeremy sounded pretty good. We all wrote articles that parodied the work we were doing ourselves had done with Jeremy. My colleague, Stuart Jenks, now professor of medieval history at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, was working on the Black Death in 14th century Würzburg. He grew up in Southern California, and so his article was on the Black Death in 14th century Los Angeles, a sort of jus d'esprit. Well, I was about to tell you about the evil time 10 years ago when there were things like InfoSeek around that were pretending to bring together and organize and manage the information of the web in authoritative ways. And I was going to fish out the screen grab that Stuart and I got when his article about the Black Death in 14th century Los Angeles got picked up by two different sites like that. So I came in here this morning to look this up, did the Google search, and from ppl.woodstock.edu, a page about the Black Death, look down at the one that's a little bit purple, Black Death in the Civitas, the testimony of the anonymous Los Angelensis. There it is, Civitas Nostra Domini Reginae Angelorum, the testimony of the anonymous Los Angelensis. That's the map which accompanied it. The Colles Silvae Sanctae, that's Holywood Hills. This shouldn't fool anybody, but in fact, it's now been fooling people for about 15 years. I used to use this as an example of the poor quality of material found on the web, but I think I've learned something different as well. It's not the poor quality of material found on the web that's the problem. Poor quality of material has been with us for a long time. Augustine would have told me since the Garden of Eden, as a matter of fact. A fair amount of nonsense, a fair amount of drivel has been written and disseminated at all ages of human history. That's not the problem. The problem is the selection mechanism, how you go about finding, in a world of dispersed attention, the material of the highest possible quality. When that mechanism breaks down, when academics are telling you to read this because they haven't had enough time to read it, they haven't had enough time to look at it, and it sounds good, the title has Latin in it after all. Sorry, I'm remembering a recent sequel to Inspector Morse on PBS in which the man said, "This is Oxford, everything here means something in Latin." Lots of things still mean something in Latin. If you don't have mechanisms for finding and filtering your way through the vast quantity of material that we have, you will not find authoritative information. And it is not entirely the fault of our students that they, with what skills we have provided them, do not always find the best article, the best journal, in the best place. What I want to suggest for publishing and for learned societies, this is my point and I open it as a question and a possibility, is to say that the traditional mechanisms that I spoke of a few minutes ago for identifying what constitutes publication, those first three channels are the ones where we have concentrated our effort over time. At the moment, I would say the American Philological Association has outsourced item number 4 to the Johns Hopkins University Press and JSTOR, and we trust them to go out and find an audience for us. Our other audience is members of our association. There are, 3,000 of those. They know all about the journal. We don't need to market it to them. What I am struck by as we look forward and think about how journals, serious publication, scholarly publication can and will survive, is that in a world in which there is a very, very large quantity of poor quality material, there's also going to be a very, very large quantity of, pretty good material. And a very, very large quantity of really quite good, almost good enough material. You can decide for yourselves which of those categories you want to put Wikipedia in based on the last Wikipedia article you read. Differentiating and achieving mind share from a worldwide audience, including people who don't have the advantages of moving to and fro in Butler Library, when there isn't just the first-rate quality information, but there's also the really quite good quality information and the really almost good enough quality information, and they are all at pains to masquerade for another, does, it seems to me, impose a new obligation on those who care about the highest quality information. Not simply to distribute it with the appropriate brand and trust the world to come and find it, but to think instead about what it is we have to do in order to bring that to the attention of a wider world. And that seems to me to be potentially destabilizing in an interesting and possibly productive way for learned societies. To think of ourselves as having to market our discipline as much as to represent and guide and protect it is unfamiliar for most of it. The APA has another publication that I am not responsible for. It's called Amphora. It is our outreach division's newsletter. It's really quite engaging. It has illustrations. It has stories about recent discoveries of archaeology. It has entertaining stories about the classics in modern film. And at the same time, it reaches its audience with some difficulty. The one audience we know our outreach newsletter always reaches is members of the association who get a free copy mailed to them all the time. That doesn't quite qualify as outreach yet, but we know we have not yet found a way in which to distribute our information through that channel that really reaches a wider audience. Are we good at marketing? Can we do marketing? I think at the end of a talk I gave some years ago to something called the Society for College and University Planners, in a crowded auditorium in Vancouver, in the days when I guess I counted as an internet evangelist. At the end of the talk, somebody back in row 23 stood up and said, "I was struck that you were using the word marketing so much. You're a classics professor. What do you know about that kind of subject?" I had an answer for him. It was my answer then, it's my answer now, and it's a hopeful answer. and that is that marketing, after all, was invented for us by the Greeks. They just called it rhetoric. It seems to me that we have some hope, if we can imagine, understand our cultural history, to think about ways to learn again from the Greeks and to learn again from ourselves something of the answers to the kind of problems that we pose for ourselves. Thank you.
I mean, occasionally people write books, but not to present new material. Most scientists probably have never written a book. Okay. And society, the connection between the journals and society is somewhat different. I mean, so, for example, the American Physical Society publishes journals, important journals, not so much for the members. 27% of what we publish comes from the US. And even if a high fraction of those authors are APS members, certainly most of the 73% from elsewhere are not. Okay. And the scale of things is somewhat different. I mean, Jim was talking about the fire hose coming from blogs and the like. The APS gets a new paper submitted every 15 minutes, 24/7. Okay, and publishes about half of them. So that's about 19,000 papers a year. And there are a few other good journals around too. So just keeping track of that is a real task. Okay. Actually, we have gotten into marketing. The APS now has a thing called Physics, an email they send once a week if you sign up for it, to scientists, which tells you 4 or 5 important papers of that week. And of course, if you have time, you might be able to read the email, let alone, you know. And then it gives you blurbs about the articles. You don't actually have to read the whole article, you know. Now, there's also all sorts of things like the paganism.org. There are blogs out there that will tell you that Einstein was wrong, and so. Those I don't think are a problem, I think. People can filter that out. Okay. The journals do serve so far really as a indication of what is considered valid. Of course, you need to know which journal to trust and which not. But I think the non-journal literature is not so much of a problem for us now. What is a problem, what's certainly an issue that librarians with budgets will have to worry about as time goes on, is what the internet has done, has let not just amateurs put things online, but let serious authors put everything online. When I write a paper, I post it online. And then maybe a week later, I send it to a journal. Okay. The mechanism, certainly in my field, the mechanism for this has been the ePrint archive, which started at Los Alamos and is now at Cornell. You can post a paper there. There's a minimal filtering. So an obvious crackpot paper doesn't get posted, but almost anything else will get posted. You can put it in a perfectly fine format. I can, using LaTeX, format something as well as any journal can. If you're not an English speaker, it may not be in very good English, but that can be done. So it's up there, it's freely accessible. Okay? So you might ask, why do we need journals? Why do people want journals? Well, traditionally, the journal did several things. It did peer review, which certifies the validity, both to other scientists in the field who may not feel they can't judge it for themselves, but also to deans and provosts and department chairs and the like who might be making decisions about hiring, promotions, and so on. Okay. That the archive can't do. Then the journals did formatting, copy editing. As I said, that you can do for yourself now. The journals do translating, taking quasi-English into English, and that certainly is a valuable thing. And then they distribute it and archive it. And that really can be done by the archive now. In fact, people more, certainly in my field, in high energy physics, commonly if you know a paper has been published in a journal you respect, you will then go to the archive to get a copy to read, because you can access the archive anywhere you happen to be, whereas to access the journal, you either have to be at your institution, or if your institution allows you to log in remotely, you can go in through a few steps and get it there. But the archive is absolutely free. Okay, so how do people feel about this? Well, certainly when the archive first appeared, there was some speculation that people would stop submitting to journals. Okay? That hasn't happened. In my field, I would say essentially 100%, certainly I would say 100, at least 99.5%, probably truly 100% of the papers that Physical Review D publishes, that's 4,000 papers, are on the archive. Usually before the journal accepts it. In some cases, they're posted after. Okay. But if you go the other way, if you go to the archive, now the archive you can post things like conference proceedings and so on, which wouldn't be appropriate for a journal. But if you look at the article type things posted on the archive, essentially 100% of them are submitted to journals. The authors do want the peer review. They want the stamp of validity that a journal will give. Now, you could be cynical and say that's because they care about the deans, provost chairs, and so on, and want to get promoted, and so on. But as you know, in experimental high-energy physics, there are some fairly large collaborations. We get papers with 600, 700 authors. Soon it will be 2,000 once the new accelerator in Geneva starts working. Okay? So, if you're one of 700 people, listed alphabetically. So if you're Mr. Altonen or Abe or so on, then you'll become very well known. But otherwise, you're lost in the middle. There's no indication of who did the primary work on that particular paper. It's absolutely useless in terms of judging individuals, deciding on promotions and hiring. Okay. In addition, these collaborations have a lot of internal review before they submit a paper. Nevertheless, they submit all of their papers to journals. When I look at the referee reports, generally these are refereed more carefully than theoretical papers with only a few authors. Yeah. And there will be lots of arguing if, say, the referee says this isn't good enough for the letters journal, it should go into the regular journal. There'll be lots of arguing back and forth. So people care about the publishing, even when it's not a question of individual promotions and the like. But there's a worry. Okay. Right now, you could say, if I were a librarian, I might say, well, if all of the material is freely available at the archive, and you can know it's public information when a paper has been accepted by a journal, why don't you just wait to see if it's been accepted by a journal you respect, then go read it on the archive, and then we won't have to pay for a subscription. Okay? Well, right now that's not an issue because it's only I would say high-energy physics is the only field where it's really 100% coverage. Other fields, its coverage is spotty. In both math and physics, the coverage is partial enough that you certainly do really need to have the journal to be able to read all the literature that you want to read. But that could change. Suppose that the archive percentage goes up in other fields. Okay, then libraries might be tempted to cancel subscriptions. But this is something, peer review is something that the community wants, that I think is very important for scholarly publication. But the real costs, okay? If I looked up the APS data, which is online, the cost per paper, not the charge to the library, the actual cost to the APS of producing a paper, it's about $850 per submitted paper, which comes to about $1,600 per published paper. And a little bit of that is from physical production of a journal for the places that still actually receive hard copy journals. But most of that is for things, editorial work. If you have 35,000 papers coming in to be sent out to referees and referee reports to be analyzed and maybe sent to another referee, that's a lot of professional staff that you need to do that. Okay. You need also lots of IT backup because all of this is done electronically now. You do need, even online, things do have to be typeset, maybe isn't the right word, but have to be put into a proper format, and the servers have to be maintained, and so on. So that's real cost. Now, most scientific societies, there's a little bit, they actually charge the libraries a little bit more, and goes to other activities of the society, education, public affairs. Forget that. Suppose you just wrote that off, said the society can manage somehow to get the money otherwise. There's still a question of how do you pay for the editorial process? For physics, for APS, that's $30 million you're talking about. Where's it going to come from? Well, it seems to me the possibilities are the readers, which effectively are the ones paying now, except the libraries pay it for us, okay? The authors, which I'll come back to, or third parties. Maybe, you could say, maybe the government will do that. Maybe we could get the NSF to pay for scientific journals. Well, I'm not sure you could, particularly if they say 73% of those authors are foreigners living elsewhere. Oh, I mean, that's a... Okay. So, many people say, have the authors pay. There can be unexpected consequences. The model in physics used to be that there were page charges. So when I was much younger, we paid $50 a page maybe for every article that was published. And that's when $50 was $50. It was real money. You could even buy lunch for that. Well, at some point, around 1979, Physical Review raised its charges from something like $70 a page to $80 a page. Not a big difference. But what happened, some research groups decided they couldn't pay that increase. So they started subscribing. They started submitting to a journal published by a commercial publisher, whom I won't name. Then others started doing that, and very quickly, most of the best work was being submitted to this commercial journal, saving the research groups lots of money in page charges, but unbeknownst to them, increasing tremendously the cost to the libraries. And this could happen now, when people talk about open access. Well, open access means the readers don't pay. It doesn't mean somebody has to pay for the cost. And it's a problem whose solution I don't know. And I will leave it for the, for the moment, it's not, for the moment, it's not there because the archive hasn't penetrated enough. But the time will come, and I think it's going to be a problem to which I do not yet know the answer. Okay. But maybe I should stop now, and we can. So. So now I think you have questions for both of us. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me maybe put a footnote on that last comment. I think you've highlighted that the production and distribution of academic widgets differs from the production and distribution of most other widgets. The only reason you would pay page charges to have your article published is if there's real benefit to you of a non-monetary variety or a not directly sales
Yes, yes.
variety from doing this. And there are too many stakeholders in this who have different kinds of financial interests. The librarian has a particular financial interest of wanting to get all possible information for users without direct reference to whether it ever actually gets used or not, and that's also an unusual kind of transaction. I think I buy books that way, but I don't know many other people who buy any object in the, I'll buy all of it there is in case I ever need to use some of it. But we recognize that as perfectly rational in libraries, but it creates difficult for the economist to analyze incentives in the system.
Or they will buy a journal not knowing what percentage they might want.
Exactly, yeah, sure. Okay.
Yes, hello, sir. My name's Alyssa Winokur. I'm an LIU student from Palmer Library Science. I have more of a question. It's more of a comment. You said with open access, someone has to pay, but what about advertising? Like on the sites itself?
That's a possibility,
Or you-
whether, you'd ask the New York Times about it, though. They're having problems getting enough money advertising online. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a potentially viable, that's a potentially viable thing. I don't know that, say, you'd get enough people interested in advertising and physical review to make enough money.
Actually, I'm talking more of the online databases. The current research is suggesting that trend to make them, to lower down the cost, to so people who have related products and get their product line known to the consumer.
In principle, I don't see any objection. Whether, I would be surprised if you could make enough money that way.
Thank you, sir.
Let me pull an analogy for this of an example of open access that is failing before our eyes and failing astonishingly. Television. Once upon a time, advertising paid for television, and all the television content was free. Now, you pay for the television content. It's not the pay TV of 40 or 50 years ago, pay-per-view, I don't know what the numbers are on that, but the fundamental model, according to which essentially all of us have been suckered into paying for TV and getting the ads, is not paying per program. It's not even paying per channel. I wish you could pay per channel. I wish I could select 3 channels that I want and see those channels, please, instead of having to upgrade $29 a month in order to get the one channel. But we've been moved toward a subscription model, toward an information service, which gives us in the full form TV and movies and music. I know somebody who's got 147 channels of music that comes with their package, their premium package, and so forth. And that has gotten people to cough up the money in order to get the product, even while the advertising still stays there. I guess the lesson I would draw from that is that over time, these relationships are in fact market relationships, and when people think the advertising really works, they'll pay for advertising. When they think it doesn't, they won't. At the moment, the last 10 years, Google has done quite well on the idea that people are willing to pay extraordinary amounts in sum totals, little bits at a time, for Google kind of advertising. I am very proud of the fact that I never notice any advertising on Google, and I never respond to any of it. I'm sure I don't. Yeah, well, okay. But
Subliminally.
the likelihood, except I like in my Gmail, I like the funny ones that show up, where it's picked up some word in my mail and given me the improbable answer. But I would only say there's probably some future moment at which there's an article in the online Wall Street Journal that Google ad revenues are plummeting because, and I don't know enough to know what the because is or when that would happen, but it isn't guaranteed that Google will be able to be Google based on ad revenues forever, for a whole variety of reasons.
Jim, I found your plea for scholarly societies to get the high-quality information out worldwide to be really appealing. And you didn't, in talking about that, talk about open access directly, if I remember. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on open access as the solution to that. I mean, clearly, marketing on the part of the APS doesn't help much if the scholar in China can't afford for his institution to purchase this material. And we've recently seen this announcement from 5 institutions for this compact on open access publishing, which is an effort to change this model and to say, let's have institutional funds that would back up non-grant funded publication charges. And I'm just curious how you would look at that. Is that a possible solution to this?
Well, I like free. I like things that are free. I like to get them for nothing. And I recognize that for a variety of reasons, I don't always succeed in doing so. I guess I would say that I think that this little war that librarians and academics are on the edge of about open access is, in the medium to long term, a distraction from the larger question of how we're going to produce, develop, sustain, distribute high-quality information for a wide audience. I'm perfectly prepared to believe that you can make information available free if somebody else pays for it. I'm perfectly prepared to believe that you could even drive the price down. And I mean, look, Apple with iTunes has proven that you can sell songs for 99 cents, which you didn't used to get to do. I think 45s back when I was young probably cost 99 cents. Inflation has kicked in, but they've discovered that if you break it down into the granular product, sell it for a low enough price, you can sell a whole lot of things, and maybe that model works. I will instance, and if any of you know my habits in giving talks, it's not surprised that I do so, the case of Beanie Babies. Beanie Babies are the small plush toys that were introduced about 15 years ago by a guy who used to sell stuffed animals for a big company and thought he saw an opportunity. And he created a craze that lasted for about 5 years on the discovery that $5.95 was a price point at which the American kid could buy a whole lot of individual stuffed toys. Cabbage Patch dolls had been the craze of a decade before, but by the time you had 2 or 3 $39 Cabbage Patch dolls, you had about as many Cabbage Patch dolls as you and the whole neighborhood needed to see for one whole lifetime. But you make them 6 inches tall, and you make them cute, and you continue to diversify them, and the average American kid could buy 200 of those and always be ready to buy one more. So maybe we can drive the price down to where it is low enough to be negligible. And I would say a revenue stream that did come from India and China and was in the pennies per might actually turn out to be, in fact, if India and China become big customers, pennies per from India and China could probably float a fair number of editors and publishers. We don't know. I'm empirical about that. I'm struck as I'm in the middle of these arguments in a variety of ways that when I pull back and try to take a longer perspective on these things, to me, the problem isn't in the end that we can do something that we can afford to pay for doing it. It's that when you produce, I'll make it the principle of supply and demand. When you produce an infinite quantity of supply, the value of the individual artifact begins to approach zero. You may not read every article in your field these days. It's just possible. And that's a way of saying not every article in your field is as exciting and important to you as others. You're making a choice. And if there are 1,000 articles a year coming out that I must read, those articles as individual items, whatever I may think about them notionally, are going to be of lower value. I'll do one number that I was looking at the other day. There's a standard bibliography of classical scholarship called L'Année philologique, been published in Paris since 1920. It seeks to index everything published in a given academic year in the fields of Greek and Latin. When I graduated from college, it was doing 8,000 items a year. In the last published volume, which is 5 years ago because it takes a while to do all of this, they were up to 17,000 items. Doesn't feel to me as though the discipline of classics is twice as large as it was when I was young, but I do know that I'm having trouble keeping up with the stuff because there really genuinely is twice as much of it. Managing that kind of quantity, imagining that kind of quantity forward, seems to me to be the real problem that will control what we can do, and pricing by comparison to that, to me, is it's a small issue, it's one that can be worked out empirically, and yeah, I'm all in favor of free, but I'm also all in favor of the people who do this not going broke, because when they go broke, you don't get the information either.
Dr. O'Donnell, you said something about we having practiced scholarship a certain way for hundreds of years and how that model is changing. But it occurs to me that it's not only the model that's changed, but also the we that then encompasses. I don't number among the we that's been practicing scholarship your way for hundreds of years. As manuscripts are being made available online, they're being sort of democratized. And the we has expanded to include people like your friend from China and me, a mother of two with 3 jobs, who can do her PhD because her research is sitting on her lap right now. And this clogs the job pool, I understand. But then perhaps on the infinite quality of supply, the infinite quantity, I mean to say not quality, of supply, that might just drive us to aspire to more, it drives us to aspire higher to almost impossible scholarly feats, because of the competition. I wondered about what you thought about the positive side, perhaps, of all of this digital possibility.
Oh, I think there are immense positive sides. I recognize dinosaurish characteristics in myself. I found the 1-volume Oxford Standard Authors Boswell's Life of Johnson for $10 in a bookstore yesterday, and I couldn't control myself. I've read it twice before. I may never read it again, but there was no choice. It had to follow me home, no matter what. That's a curious practice in its own right. Yes, look, we have trained traditionally, we humanists particularly, have trained traditionally our students and ourselves to think that information is limited in quantity and that success means developing the hunter-gatherer skills to go out and find every single piece of information and then put it together in an absolutely convincing pattern. Okay, multiply the quantity of information by 2 orders of magnitude, and you can't do that anymore. We don't yet, as historians, as researchers of the kind of things I work on, have a theory that we can live with of how you would do sampling and surveying and averaging on your evidence, because we are so caught in this model of ourselves as the hunter-gatherers who go find that one more article that's going to solve this problem for us. Growing up in and imagining yourself living in a space that is too large for you to control that way, you will develop other techniques of control that will be functionally equivalent, but possible for an actual human being to manage. At this point, to say to a young person getting out of college, you wish to work on the writings of St. Augustine, okay, there's 5 million words in Latin available, and the bibliography has been growing alarmingly for the last few generations. Go away and read it all and come back when you're serious. It's not going to happen. But there is work that can and should be done. There are questions that need asking, questions we can answer, and techniques that will evolve to answer them. And I happily recognize that it will be the innovators of each next generation that will find the ways to do this in a persuasive fashion.
I'd say certainly the web and moving to electronic publishing has democratized things. I mean, certainly 15 years ago, before most scientific journals were online. The University of Delhi could get copies of those journals, and probably to save costs, they would be shipped by sea and arrive several months later in fields where several months makes a big difference. You know, now, they can be read, well, they're certainly from the journal. As soon as the journal publishes them, if they have a subscription, they can get it. If it's on the archive, they can get that several months earlier, before it's been published by the journal. And certainly, I think in terms of trying to understand what the new financial model is going to be, we need to recognize that there are parts of the world where people can't pay the same amount of money that can be paid here. I imagine the University of Delhi library budget is a little bit smaller than Columbia's. You know,
But you mentioned the 27% of authors who are United States. I think I've seen from the physics publishers the chart showing how that has changed. And in fact, that's a measure of the democratization, that more and more articles come from more and more countries.
Well, it's a very interesting chart that the Physical Review has. They plot online, you know, the number of submissions. And if you look, US submissions have been absolutely flat for about 20 years, as has US support, you know, government support for physics, adjusted for inflation. But you see Europe going up a bit, and Asia just rising like that.
Yeah, Ron.
I'm Ron Musto. I'm one of the co-directors of the ACLS Humanities ebook initiative. We'll be reporting to Jim tomorrow as a member of our board. I want to make 2 points that more...
And also a publisher of fine books, too, of a more traditional variety.
Yes, softcover paper books,
Yep.
which still sell very well, thanks. I want to reiterate 2 points that primarily Jim made. One is a non-ideological approach to open access. That we do live in a mixed economy, and a mixed approach is probably the best that we should take. For example, even on our own site, we have open access titles and titles that we put behind a subscription wall. And I do believe it is a distraction right now, the discussion. Things will evolve in which the notion of sustainability is put in its proper perspective, and the proper agents of that sustainability will be brought forward. And the second is Jim's point that we bring down the unit cost of these things so that they're practically open access. In fact, we're working right now on negotiations with both Chinese consortium and Indian consortium that if they're successful, the unit price of a monograph per year will be someplace between 8 and 12 cents a year for one of our monographs. And if you divide that over the actual retail price of a monograph, that's about 400 years worth of monograph per title. So that these things are in the works, and they are within the realm of possibility, of practical possibility.
Yeah, let me just say, in terms of pricing, I mean, clearly, the more you distribute, the lower the unit cost. But for example, for journal articles, one irreducible thing you want is that the paper be refereed, and you need full-time paid people managing that process, sending things out to referees, evaluating the reports, and so on. And just that part of the process is going to cost several $100s per paper.
I would emphasize in connection with that the non-dollar part of that in many disciplines and parts of disciplines is not insignificant. When I think of the issues in our learned society, one that affects me is the availability of volunteer talent of very high quality and its willingness to spend time on peer reviewing and editorial functions. There's only so much of that talent that I think you're ever going to get out of American classics professors, and no matter what we want to think about how we could organize material better, we could in principle do something. If you don't get more people like me than there are people like me who are willing to do some of that stuff, to do it, it just won't get done at a good quality. And that's the problem with the Black Death article. It's not that anybody wanted to put crap on their website. It's that they didn't have enough time and talent and enough patience to go through and differentiate a joke from something serious. Pleasure talking to you.